Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And this time I'm going to be looking at the work of the economist John Maynard Keynes in 1945 at the end of the Second World War, and the problem that Britain faced, the epic financial crisis that Britain faced at the end of the war, and the attempts that Keynes made to try to remedy this by getting a loan from Washington, D.C. But before we delve into that story, we need to really investigate who John Maynard Keynes was and what his significance was as an economist and political thinker. Keynes was born into a Cambridgeshire family. He was something of the middling sort, far from being upper middle class or even aristocratic. His father was a well-known economist, and his various siblings had fairly glittering academic careers of their own. Keynes joined the civil service. He went to Eton and Cambridge. He was a scholarship boy at Eton, so again, he wasn't part of the inner circle of the aristocracy. He went to Eton and Cambridge, and then joined the civil service. But he didn't spend an awful lot of time there. In the years before World War I, he returns to academia. And his first love really was philosophy, but he showed he had something of a penchant for economics. But he was recalled to government service during the First World War. One of Keynes's very important contributions to victory in the First World War was the creation of a very complicated system of financing and guaranteeing loans between Britain and France, Russia, and ultimately having this underwritten by America. This ensured that particularly Russia was able to go on financing and fighting long after the country was bankrupt. And one of the knock-on effects of this is that after February 1917, this degree of finance really keeps the provisional government trapped in the war, unable. Not that the provisional government was even really realistically considering it, but unable to leave the conflict as per the wishes of a great many Russians. Keynes's big break, and the thing that made his name, was his appointment as a financial representative of the British government to the Paris Peace Conference. And it was his general contempt for the proceedings, or for the outcome of the proceedings, that caused him to write his 1920 book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in which he rubbished the punishment of Germany, saying that not one significant economic, social, or political issue that faced Europe had been resolved. Instead, the desire for punishment had outweighed all these considerations. The question of Russia and the new Bolshevik regime had not been addressed. The impending crises in many Western and Eastern European countries that was threatening to plunge many over the edge back into totalitarian government or ignite fresh wars. That was not addressed, and the problem of devastation, disease, and famine that racked Europe in 1919 and 1920 were largely ignored and overlooked. The book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, was very influential at the time, hugely popular, and it was one of the first question marks against the Versailles Settlement, of which many would follow. If you read The Deluge by Adam Tooze, he has a slightly revisionist take on the economic consequences of the peace, and suggests that Keynes may have been slightly over the top in his critique, and it may not have been quite as unjust and disastrous a peace as we might be led to believe. But for Keynes's purposes, the book elevated him to the level of what we would call public intellectual. He was the go-to person on the subject of economics. One of his main contentions, and it becomes increasingly popular throughout the 1930s, as there are various voices in Britain that say that the Paris Peace Conference and the Versailles Settlement had been too harsh on Germany. His main hope was that reparations could be set at a far lower level in order to prevent the German population from being or from deciding to permanently exclude itself from the emergent world system at the end of the war. But this is something that doesn't happen. Instead, two peers, Lord Sumner and Lord Cunliffe, become part of the inner sanctum of the delegation, and they set the reparations figure. They were referred to as the Heavenly Twins because they set the figure for reparations at 6.6 billion gold Reichsmarks as an astronomically high level. He continued in the early 1920s to campaign for a revision of the treaty, and said that the policies that were being introduced around the world in the post-war era, which are not dissimilar to our austerity policies today, were absolutely ruinous and disastrous. This kind of reducing public spending and tightening belts at a time of economic crisis only served to exacerbate the situation because, as Keynes was later to argue, the level of aggregate demand in an economy was the factor that would set the level of prosperity. And by dampening aggregate demand, by taking money out of the economy so people can't and won't spend and have no confidence in future economic performance, you ensure that the crisis will continue. Keynes in the 20s and 30s, his great contribution to economics and the development really of his of the practice of macroeconomics was his challenge to classical economic thinking. Classical economic thinking that dates back to the 18th century and the likes of David Ricardo and Adam Smith, argues that the market operates as an invisible hand. It is there. It is a kind of a self-regulating system, almost a kind of a part of nature, or in the view of the classical economists, part of God's work. And it regulated itself, that it made sure that over time unemployment would be eliminated, and by simply the workings of the market, and the less that government could do, so much the better. That when government interfered in the market or in markets, that problems arose. Neoclassical economists or neoliberal economists of the later 20th century, the likes of Milton Friedman, would later kind of express this as in terms of price signals, that when a person chose to work or apply for a job, they were essentially sending a price signal into the labour market indicating what their labour was worth, i.e. how much they would work for. If a government offered income support or other benefits to make people's lives better, or to kind of shield people from the effects of poverty, you were essentially damaging those price signals and distorting them, because people would demand higher wages or prefer to do no work and be subsidised for it than to do work at all. Keynes said, well, this doesn't make any sense. Ultimately, the price signals that you're transmitting into an economy don't have any overall outcome in terms of sort of depression or inflation. Instead, it is the amount of demand an economy has within it, aggregate demand. So he proposed monetary and fiscal policies to deal with dips in demand, i.e. recessions or depressions. What Keynes argued was that government intervention in terms of taxation and spending could take out the peaks and troughs of business cycles. So when an economy went into a trough, a government could spend, providing it had taxed when an economy was going into a peak of economic activity, thus taking the sting out of inflation, or the heat out of inflation. This policy it would not completely eliminate unemployment or inflation, but it would make sure that the distance between the peaks of a business cycle and the troughs were greatly ameliorated and levelled out. So Keynes did see that there was a role for government in the management of the economy. This is not a popular idea prior to the Great Depression. After the Great Depression, after the Second World War as well, in the 50s and 60s, it is simply an article of faith that the government has a key role to play in economic management. Much of Keynes's original theories are adopted and then developed, and things that Keynes perhaps hadn't advocated in terms of the role of government transpire in Britain really up until the advent of Margaret Thatcher in 1979. Actually, it's worth clarifying that one particular point, that for much of her first term, Margaret Thatcher doesn't abandon commitments to welfare state spending, and it's only as the Thatcher governments throughout the 1980s become progressively more radical, and then the major government after it, that the strands of the post-war consensus are gradually stripped away. And it's throughout the 1930s that Keynesian ideas are far more widely embraced in America than they are in Great Britain. After 1929, and particularly after 1931, the British government engage in very rigorous austerity policies. In America, despite the embracing by Franklin Roosevelt's advisors, the brains trust of some of Keynes' ideas, the word Keynesianism is never particularly used, and despite the American government's best efforts, America doesn't really emerge from a depression until the advent of the war. Keynes argued, and this is, I think, really taken on as economic orthodoxy now, that the circulation of money in an economy would have a multiplier effect, that if money was injected into the economy in terms of wages for public road building, then the workers would very quickly spend the money that they had gained. It is very unlikely that they would put it into a high-interest savings account and keep it away for a rainy day. People who are facing tough economic circumstances normally go and spend on important things right away. The spending would stimulate orders from shops who would want to buy in more of the same stuff, and this would then stimulate orders in factories who would then take on workers, and those workers would then spend, and there would be a kind of a very quick trickle-down effect. It must be borne in mind that the trickle-down effect means something really quite different and is used by very different kinds of economists. But there would be a flow of money through society. So every dollar or every pound spent would, if in effect, have a multiplier effect, and it would equate into many dollars within the economy, or many pounds, as each dollar would change hands many times, and would be essentially a source of liquidity for large numbers of people. So $1 printed would equate to perhaps hundreds and hundreds of dollars. In 1936, Keynes wrote the book that he was most famous for, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. And it was his overall argument for government intervention in an economic slump. It challenged classical economics that put absolute faith in the invisible hand of the market, and it suggested that markets would not necessarily always create full employment and would not necessarily create optimum outcomes for all all players within the market. And the experience of the Great Depression seemed to bear out what Keynes was saying. The slump was longer and more pronounced than anyone had predicted, and it seemed that in America, in Germany, and in Great Britain, that there was nothing that individuals or businesses could do, and that really it was down to governments in order to stimulate the economy. And he argued that the old classical way of thinking about things, that workers would simply drop their labour costs, the wages that they were willing to accept, to a level that employers would deem acceptable to pay endlessly until essentially the employer was satisfied with the situation. He said, well, that doesn't happen. There are points where the unemployed will refuse to drop their labour costs, their wages, any lower, partly because it just doesn't make any sense for them to do any work, and partly because there are other factors at play in the lives of individuals. They are not what we would call homo economicus. They are not sort of rational, robot-like players in the economy that simply respond blindly to price signals. They're human beings. They're complex, and they have things like dignity, which means that price signals in the economy become conflicted. Throughout the Second World War, Keynes argued that a system of compulsory saving was the best way to pay for the war. It needed to be financed by higher taxation, but forcing the workers to save would prevent inflation. There would be less money whizzing around the economy, and then there would be money that could be spent at the end of the war when these measures were suspended, and that would prevent a slump. And whilst these ideas are to some extent taken on board, Keynes's greater contribution began in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference. Keynes proposed a plan in order. It was a kind of a grand international Keynesian plan that would prevent the build-up of trade imbalances. So it would create essentially a clearing union for trade imbalances, and that because he believed that it was ultimately trading imbalances that had led to the war in the first place. We have essentially countries with too much money and countries with not enough. He thought that managing international trade and creating incentives to prevent the build-up of surpluses or deficits within trade would be the best chance at world peace. And in order to do this, he thought creating a central bank and an international clearing union, which eventually becomes, under the guise of the United States, who become the dominant power, the International Monetary Fund. And the International Monetary Fund does not have the same purposes that Keynes envisaged it would have. That's a kind of a slightly different conversation. The World Bank and the IMF reflected the fact that America had become the dominant partner in the Anglo-American relationship, and they were the tools that America was going to use in order to dominate the world economy in the post-war era, and they were not designed to prevent the build-up of trade balances, trade deficits and surpluses. So the stability that Keynes thought he would be able to create in the world economy thereafter never emerged, and the price that would be paid for the correction of trade imbalances would be paid by deficit countries. So countries that were poorer, that had weaker comparative trading advantages in the first place, would be the ones that would be forced to kind of carry the can for the iniquities of world trade. In 1945, on the 23rd of August, a meeting at Downing Street, the Labour government is called together for an emergency meeting. Keynes is invited to the meeting, and it's the first great crisis of Labour's 6 years in office. Hugh Dalton, who'd been the Minister for Economic Warfare and the head of the Special Operations Executive during the war, sent a paper around that Keynes had written. They were old friends, Keynes and Dalton, and the paper was called Our Overseas Financial Prospects. It's a pretty despairing missive. The British Empire was in desperate economic problems at the end of the war, with debts that were more than twice the size of Britain's gross domestic product. The savings would be necessary, but more importantly, financial assistance from America would be important. Keynes referred to this as a financial Dunkirk. The year before, Churchill had met Henry Morgenthau, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, and they had said that they agreed between them that Lend-Lease would continue during the period between the defeat of Germany and that of Japan. Churchill thought that would buy the British economy enough time to adapt and change, but it was wildly naive. On the 20th of August, the US government said that aid shipments would be terminated immediately. And this comes as a kind of a hammer blow to the British economy. The problem that Labour faces also is that during 1945 they had campaigned obviously on a manifesto of social welfare and dramatic expansion in the size and the role of the state in health, education, housing and old age pensions, based on the popularity really of the Beveridge report. How this was now going to be paid for was a moot point. And this was one of the problems that would dog Britain throughout the post-war era, of large overseas spending commitments and a large welfare state and a diminishing pool of resources in order to pay for it. Keynes went to Washington with Lord Halifax. He went there and to his dismay discovers that Harry Dexter White, who had been his opposite number at the Bretton Woods negotiations and who had stymied most of what Keynes had proposed at Bretton Woods, was on the negotiating team. The two were clashed against one another. Both were in their own right fairly obnoxious. Keynes was, it must be said, a kind of an egotistical, opinionated, and quite boorish individual from time to time, who thought of himself as the kind of an iconoclastic genius. And the Americans were not prepared to simply allow Keynes' ego to walk all over them. Many Americans who had American negotiators, diplomats, and politicians who had been close to Roosevelt throughout the war had been dismayed from time to time that the British had got away with developments in the policy towards Nazi Germany that was definitely not in America's best interests. And at the end of the war, there was a consensus that the British would not be getting away with things yet again. Keynes went to America, he'd originally suggested securing a commercial loan. He hoped that Great Britain would be given a grant or a gift, and that gift would reflect Britain's loan stance against the Nazis in between 1940 and 1941, and that this would be kind of Britain's reward, if you will. In September, it transpires that the Americans aren't willing to roll over and do whatever Britain insists, and they look at the figures that Keynes presented and say there's no chance of you being given a gift by us. And there was a general feeling across America in 1945 of mistrust towards the British, and a feeling that the British might possibly use the money to prop up their empire, thus meaning that the Americans would have perhaps been duped into defending Britain's empire for them. And the population at large, a poll is carried out that suggests 60% of Americans were opposed to the loan. 2 weeks into the talks, and Keynes met with Harry Dexter White and the American delegation, and the deal that's put on the table is that America would offer $5 billion, but there would be conditions attached. The loan would be an interest-bearing loan, and Britain must follow through on the commitment she'd made at Bretton Woods to make sterling fully convertible. Now, this is the killer. The paying interest is all fine and well, but making the pound sterling fully convertible meant that at a certain point, any investor that had a large quantity of pounds could take them all out of the country or convert them all into US dollars. Now, if one was to look at the American economy in 1945 and the British economy in 1945, the American economy would be clearly the one to invest in. And in 1947, when convertibility is allowed, it allows for a huge drain of cash from British coffers, plunging Britain into the real post-war austerity that she faces. The loan seemed to be enough for Britain's purposes, and Halifax suggests giving America use of British military bases in the UK. So the bases that America had used, particularly in East Anglia, to bomb Germany, would now be used places like RAF Mildenhall, and that kind of thing. And there are still US service personnel there today and US aircraft that fly from these bases today. Keynes also has to get Attlee's government in Great Britain on side, and they have to send all manner of complicated telegraphs back to London that probably only Keynes really understood the content of anyway. The recipient of many of these telegraphs was the very down-to-earth Ernest Bevin, who was quite open about the fact that he didn't get it. The left of the Labour Party, led by Nye Bevan, suggested that the loan was more trouble than it was worth and we should be negotiating harder. The centre of the party, Hugh Dalton and Clement Attlee, thought it was probably worthwhile taking the loan, but felt that were kind of shocked by the cost of it. And the negotiations eventually are concluded with the loan being accepted, and the accepting of the loan and of Keynes's work to accept the loan really does shape an awful lot of the post-war era. It shows that the British economy, when convertibility happens, is thrown into crisis, and it's no coincidence that the 9 years later, in 1956, when Britain has the bright idea of becoming involved in the Suez fiasco and challenges really American hegemony in that part of the world, in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, particularly hegemony as the great decision-making power of the Cold War, the device that the Americans use against the British to pull them back into line is a threat of a further run on the pound, which is something that Britain cannot stomach. Okay, so I hope you found that useful today, and if you did, and if you find the Explaining History podcast useful in general, we could really do with your support just at the moment with some of the funding and hosting costs. So we've got one of them crowdfunding thingies on the Explaining History Facebook page. I'll put in a link along with this podcast. Any generous donations that you can give would be gratefully received. If, by the way, you've previously donated, please don't donate again. You've been more than kind and more than generous. And your help has been gratefully received. So please don't feel you have to contribute if you've already given. That's absolutely fine. Anyway, thanks very much for listening, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. We're coming up to the 100,000th subscriber soon. When we do, there is going to be a free giveaway. IB Taurus are great pals in the publishing industry have agreed to give away a mystery title, but more will be revealed in the next few weeks. So stay tuned for that one. All the best. Bye-bye.